Bitterroot Valley, Montana, November 1888. While every homesteader in the valley was racing to build square cabins with tall walls and peaked roofs before winter arrived, 16-year-old James Whitaker was constructing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone who saw it. His structure rose from the mountainside like a giant tortoise shell, round and low to the ground, built partially into the slope itself, with walls that curved inward as they rose, topped with a dome that seemed to defy every principle of proper construction. The entrance faced southeast, protected by an extending curved wall that created a pocket of still air. The whole thing measured just 18 feet across at its widest point, with walls no more than 7 feet at the center, made from stones carefully selected and fitted without mortar. Packed with clay and moss, then covered with layers of sod that made the structure nearly invisible against the mountainside. "The boy's building himself a grave," Thomas Harrigan said at the Sunday gathering outside the trading post, loud enough for James to hear from where he stood, collecting his weekly supplies. Harrigan owned the largest ranch in the valley, employed a dozen men, and considered himself the authority on everything from cattle to construction. Round walls won't hold weight. That dome will collapse with the first heavy snow. He'd be better off spending winter in the stable with the horses. But James had no intention of changing his design. He had spent 3 years learning from his grandfather, a Shoshone elder named Stanzen Wind, before the old man died of pneumonia the previous spring. And his grandfather had taught him that the square cabin settlers built were fighting the wind rather than working with it. "Wind is like water," Stanzen Wind had said. "It flows around what is smooth and tears at what has corners. The white men build walls to stop the wind. My people built shelters to let it pass." Before we continue with James's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a 16-year-old orphan who built a shelter that would survive conditions that destroyed conventional cabins, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to James's story. There had been a time when James's life held warmth and certainty. His mother had been a school teacher from Boston. His father, a surveyor who had come west with the railroad. They had settled in the Bitterroot Valley when James was 7, building a proper cabin near the creek with glass windows his mother had insisted on bringing from back east. His mother taught him to read from books she'd carried across the country, while his father showed him how to read the land itself, how to measure elevation and calculate grades, how to see what a place could become. Then came the diphtheria outbreak of 1885. His mother died first, struggling to breathe in the cabin she'd made beautiful with curtains and carefully tended herbs growing in tin cans on the windowsill. His father followed 6 days later, having nursed her without sleep until his own body gave out. James was 13 years old, suddenly alone, except for his father's notebook full of careful surveys and his mother's books. His uncle Raymond, his father's older brother, had taken him in with all the warmth of a man accepting an unwanted obligation. Raymond had failed at mining, failed at ranching, and was slowly failing at running a way station 20 miles south of Missoula, drinking away whatever profit the place might have generated. He put James to work immediately, mucking stables, hauling water, chopping wood for 12 hours a day, while Raymond sat inside drinking whiskey and complaining about the unfairness of having to feed another mouth. James watched and learned. He watched how Raymond's station, built square and tall to look impressive, caught every wind that came down the valley, how the corners created eddies that tore at the shingles, how the narrow windows and high ceilings made it impossible to heat, how Raymond burned through cords of wood trying to keep 2 rooms barely comfortable, while the rest of the building stayed cold enough to freeze water. He watched travelers arrive half frozen, grateful for any shelter, paying Raymond's inflated prices because they had no choice. He also watched his grandfather when the old man came through on his way to visit relatives in the Flathead Valley. Stanzen Wind was his mother's father, though she had rarely spoken of him, as if acknowledging her Shoshone heritage was something to be hidden rather than honored. But the old man stopped at Raymond's station twice a year, and he saw how his grandson was being treated. During those visits, Stanzen Wind taught James everything Raymond's harsh routine didn't allow time for. He taught him to read the land the way his father had, but differently, seeing not what could be extracted but what the land itself was trying to show. He taught him which stones held heat and which didn't, which trees indicated water below ground, how to find south on a cloudy day, how to predict weather 3 days ahead by watching how animals behaved and how clouds formed over distant peaks. "Your uncle builds against the land," Stands and Wind said, one evening, the two of them sitting outside while Raymond snored drunk inside. "He fights wind, fights cold, fights everything. This is why he is always losing. The land is stronger. You must learn to work with it, not against it." The final break came in March 1888, during a late storm that caught Raymond with no firewood split and no supplies laid in because he'd spent the previous week drinking instead of preparing. When James pointed out that they needed to start rationing food, Raymond had backhanded him hard enough to split his lip, then thrown him out into the storm with nothing but the clothes on his back. "Go live with your Indian grandfather if you're so clever," Raymond had shouted. "See how well his savage ways keep you fed." James had walked through the night. Arriving at the small camp where Stands and Wind was staying with 3 other elders, the old man took him in without question, and for 2 months James learned everything his grandfather could teach him. He learned how the Shoshone had built their winter lodges, round and low, covered with layers of hide and bark that shed wind and held warmth from a single small fire. He learned about thermal mass, though his grandfather didn't call it that, just showed him how stones heated during the day would radiate warmth through the night, how Earth itself was the greatest insulator, how water flowing beneath the ground never froze if you knew where to find it. Then his grandfather caught pneumonia after helping an injured hunter through a spring snowstorm. The old man died in his sleep with James holding his hand. His final words a whisper: "Build round, build low, let the wind pass." James buried him according to Shoshone custom, with help from the other elders. They offered to let him stay, but he could see they had little food and hard times ahead. He thanked them, took his grandfather's knife, a worn bedroll, a small pot, and the knowledge that weighed nothing but was worth more than gold, and walked back into the valley. He found work doing odd jobs, mucking stables, splitting wood, hauling freight for the trading post. He was young but strong, reliable and uncomplaining, and people paid him fairly if they didn't have to house or feed him. He slept in stables, in storage sheds, once in a chicken coop for a week. He saved every cent, spending money only on flour, beans, salt, and the occasional tin of preserved meat. By September, he had accumulated $23 and a reputation as a hard worker. He also had his eye on a piece of land nobody wanted. The ridge was 3 miles from town, steep enough that wagons couldn't reach it, rocky enough that plowing was impossible, exposed to every wind that came down from the peaks. The man who had claimed it had given up after one winter, abandoned it for better land further south. It had sat empty for 2 years. James filed a claim at the land office for $2, and the clerk had actually laughed. "Son, you can't farm rocks and you can't graze cattle on a slope that steep. What exactly do you plan to do up there?" "Survive," James had said. If you want to find out how a structure built by a 16-year-old orphan would shelter him through a winter that killed a dozen people and destroyed half the buildings in the valley, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what James Whittaker built would prove that everything the settlers thought they knew about mountain survival was wrong, and the principles he used would save lives for generations to come. James spent 2 weeks just watching before he moved a single stone. He sat on the ridge at different times of day, noting where the sun rose and set, which direction the prevailing winds came from, where snow accumulated and where it melted first, where water seeped from the rocks during afternoon warmth, and where it stayed frozen until noon. He watched how wind moved across the slope, how it accelerated over certain features and created still pockets behind others. Everyone else saw worthless land. James saw advantages invisible to conventional thinking. The slope faced southeast, catching morning sun that would warm the structure even in deep winter. The rocky soil they considered useless was actually fractured granite that had absorbed summer heat and would radiate it slowly through cold months. The exposed position that seemed like a weakness meant no tall trees to drop branches or snow bombs onto his roof. The spring seep everyone had dismissed because it was 50 yards upslope was actually perfect. Gravity would deliver water without pumping, and the constant flow meant it wouldn't freeze solid even in extreme cold. He began with the foundation in late September, and immediately did something that made no sense to everyone who saw it. Conventional wisdom said to build on top of the ground, to keep your floor elevated away from cold earth and dampness. James dug into the slope instead, excavating a circular area 18 feet across and 2 feet deep into the mountainside. The excavated earth he piled carefully to the north and west, creating a berm that would block wind and add mass. Thomas Harrigan rode up on his third day of digging, trailed by 2 of his ranch hands. "Boy, you're digging yourself deeper into stupidity," Harrigan announced, sitting tall on his horse and looking down at James like a king addressing a fool. "Ground's cold. You build down, you'll freeze. Any man with sense builds up, gets his floor away from the earth." James straightened, leaning on his shovel. "Earth 3 feet down stays at 50 degrees year-round," he said calmly. "Air at 20 below is 70 degrees colder than the ground. I'd rather be closer to 50 than 20 below." "Where did you learn that? From your savage grandfather?" One of the ranch hands snickered. "Yes," James said simply. "He lived 83 years, survived more winters than all of us combined. Seems worth listening to." Harrigan snorted. "We'll see how smart you feel when you're frozen solid come February. You're building a hole in the ground, not a house. Round walls won't hold. That's why every building from here to Washington is square, boy. Because it works." "Round holds better than square," James replied. "An arch is the strongest shape in nature. This whole structure will be one continuous arch." "Arch?" Harrigan laughed outright. "You planning to build a church? Boy, you don't have the skill for that, and you sure don't have the materials. I give you until the first snow before you're begging for work in a place in my bunkhouse." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrigan, but I'll be fine. Pride before a fall, boy. Pride before a fall." Harrigan wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following, their laughter carrying back on the wind. James returned to his digging. 3 days later, he had his circular foundation excavated and level. He'd saved the topsoil carefully, piled it separate from the subsoil and rocks. Nothing was wasted. The wall construction began in early October, and this was where James's design truly defied convention. Standard cabin building used logs stacked horizontal, squared at corners, or vertical planks nailed to a frame. Both methods created flat walls that caught wind like sails, with corners that acted as levers, multiplying the wind's force. Every gust created stress points where materials would eventually fail. James built with stone, but not the way settlers built stone houses back east, with flat walls and mortar. He selected each stone carefully, looking for specific shapes, rounded and irregular. He started with the largest stones at the foundation, setting them directly on level ground, then began laying courses above, each stone chosen to fit the one below, angled slightly inward. He used clay mixed with sand and lime he made from burned shells as a binder, but the real strength came from the stones themselves, their weight and friction and the way they locked together. The wall curved continuously with no corners, no flat sections. From the inside, it looked like standing inside a well. From outside, it rose like a natural rock formation, irregular and organic. As he built upward, the wall leaned inward more sharply, beginning the transition toward the dome that would eventually close overhead. The process was slow, meditative, each stone considered and placed with care. He worked from sunrise until dark, stopping only to eat cold beans and drink water from the spring he'd tapped with a split log trough that delivered fresh water directly to his building site. When darkness stopped work, he slept in a lean-to he'd constructed nearby, wrapped in his grandfather's bedroll, dreaming of round lodges and wind flowing like water. By mid-October, his walls were 4 feet high, and the structure's purpose was becoming visible. The curve was unmistakable now. And so was the entrance, a low opening facing southeast, with a curved wall extending outward like a protective arm. This wall, which James called a wind baffle, though he doubted anyone else would understand the term, was crucial. It created a pocket of still air in front of the entrance, a place where wind would eddy and lose force rather than blasting directly into the dwelling. Word had spread through the valley. The crazy orphan kid was building something strange up on the worthless ridge. People rode out to look, some curious, most skeptical, all of them certain he was wasting his time. One afternoon in late October, a different visitor arrived. Sarah Chen ran the trading post with her husband, and unlike most of the valley's settlers, she didn't dismiss other ways of knowing just because they were different. She rode up quietly. tied her horse, and walked around James's structure slowly, studying it with genuine interest. "May I ask you some questions?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why round? I understand you told Mr. Harrigan something about arches, but could you explain it simply?" James set down the stone he'd been shaping. "Wind hits a flat wall and stops. All that force has to go somewhere, so it pushes. Hard. Wind hits a curved wall and slides around. The force spreads out, becomes weaker. Same reason rivers carve away sharp rocks, but leave round ones alone." Sarah nodded slowly. "That makes sense. What about the entrance? Why so low?" "Heat rises. If my door was normal height, all my warm air would escape every time I opened it. Low entrance means I have to duck, but the warm air stays inside, up near the ceiling." "Clever." She walked closer. "Touch the wall. These stones fit remarkably well. My father was a surveyor. He taught me precision. My grandfather taught me patience. Every stone gets chosen for exactly where it belongs." "Your grandfather was Shoshone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did he teach you this design?" "The principles. He showed me how his people built winter lodges, round and low, covered with hides and brush. This is the same idea, but permanent. Stone and earth instead of hide and poles." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then met his eyes. "For what it's worth, I think you might be onto something. My husband thinks you're crazy, but I've noticed our trading post, which is round, stays warmer with less wood than the rectangular houses around it. People think we built it that way to look distinctive, but the truth is, it was cheaper and easier. We just got lucky with the efficiency." "You weren't lucky," James said. "You were smart." She smiled. "Well, I hope you prove everyone wrong. And when winter comes, if you need anything, you're welcome at our store. I'll make sure you get fair prices." "Thank you, ma'am." She left, and James felt marginally less alone. One person believed in him, or at least didn't think he was completely insane. It was something. The wall continued rising. By early November, he was working on the tricky transition where walls became dome, where every stone had to be cut and placed, with even more precision to maintain the curve in 3 dimensions instead of 2. This was where Harrigan predicted the structure would fail, where gravity would pull stones inward and the whole thing would collapse. James remembered his grandfather telling him about corbelling, how ancient peoples had built domed structures by overlapping each course slightly, each stone supported by those below, until the circle grew smaller and finally closed at the top. No single stone bore the full weight. Every stone was part of the structure's strength. He built a wooden frame inside, a temporary support to hold stones in position until the dome was complete and could support itself. He marked the center point, calculated the radius, and began placing stones with their outer edge aligned to the circle, their inner edge extending slightly beyond the course below. Each course was slightly smaller in diameter than the one beneath. It was exhausting, exacting work. A single miscalculation would throw off every course above. He checked and rechecked. Used string and plumb lines, measured angles with instruments his father had left him. Some days he placed only a dozen stones, rejecting dozens more, until he found ones that fit perfectly. The cold deepened. Snow dusted the peaks, melted, came again, and stayed. James worked through it, his hands raw and bleeding, wrapped in strips of cloth when the skin split from cold and abrasion. He ate standing up, slept as little as possible, driven by the certainty that winter was coming fast and he needed shelter completed before the truly brutal cold arrived. A memory surfaced while he struggled with a particularly difficult section where the curve was steepest. His grandfather, working on a pair of moccasins, explaining the importance of the curve where sole met upper. "If this angle is wrong by even a little, the whole shoe fails," Stands and Wind had said. "Water gets in, warmth gets out, foot blisters. Everything depends on precision where one thing becomes another." James adjusted the stone he was placing, trimmed it another fraction of an inch, tried again. Perfect. By Thanksgiving, the dome was 3/4 complete, a circular opening at the top, still letting in sky and weather, but the overall structure clearly intact and stable. James removed the internal wooden support frame, and the dome held without it. Every stone locked in place by every other stone, the weight distributed evenly around the entire circumference, no single point bearing more stress than any other. He built the smoke hole carefully, a circular opening 18 inches across at the crown of the dome. With a clever cap he'd fashioned from sheet metal he'd bought with precious savings. The cap sat on short legs above the hole, allowing smoke to escape while preventing rain and snow from falling directly into the fire. Wind flowing over the dome would create a low-pressure zone above the hole, drawing smoke upward even without a tall chimney. Another visitor arrived in early December, Thomas Harrigan again, this time with his wife and 2 sons, making a show of his inspection. "I'll admit, I'm surprised it hasn't collapsed yet," Harrigan said, walking around the structure. "But winter hasn't really started. Wait until we get 3 feet of snow sitting on that dome. That's when you'll see if it holds. The snow will insulate it," James said. "Add another layer of protection. Or crush it flat." Harrigan peered into the entrance. "You planning to live in that dark hole?" "It's not dark when there's a fire, and I have a window." James pointed to the southeast side, where he'd carefully constructed a small opening, 1 foot square, glazed with actual glass he'd salvaged from an abandoned cabin, the most expensive part of his entire structure when he calculated the labor he'd traded for it. "1 tiny window? That's barely enough light to see your hand." "It's enough, and it faces morning sun, so it'll provide warmth when I need it most." Harrigan's wife, a pinched woman, who always looked like she'd tasted something sour, shook her head. "It's unnatural. A house should have corners, should be proper. This looks like something animals would make." "Animals know things about shelter," James said carefully. "Bears den in round caves, birds build round nests. Maybe they understand something we've forgotten." "Blasphemy," she sniffed. "God gave man dominion over animals, not the other way around." Harrigan laid a hand on his wife's arm. "Come on, Martha. Boy's determined to learn the hard way. We'll remember this visit when we find him frozen come spring." He looked at James. "I mean that, boy. When you realize your mistake and come down from this mountain looking for help, don't expect charity. You've made your choice." They left. James returned to work. The interior required as much thought as the exterior. The floor he covered with flat stones, fitted tightly, creating a thermal mass that would absorb heat from his fire during the day and radiate it back at night. Over the stones, he spread clay, pounded and smoothed until it was nearly waterproof. The walls he plastered with more clay mixed with sand and dried grass, creating a smooth surface that reflected light and sealed any gaps where wind might penetrate. His fire pit he positioned off-center, close to the wall opposite the entrance, a small circle of stones just 2 feet across. His grandfather had taught him that small fires burned efficiently, providing enough heat without wasting fuel or creating smoke that would overwhelm the space. Large fires were for show, for people with wood to waste. Small fires were for survival. He built a sleeping platform along one curved wall, raising himself 8 inches off the floor where heat would be trapped. Storage niches he'd left in the walls during construction now received shelves made from salvaged boards, holding his meager supplies. Everything had a place. Nothing was superfluous. The door was the final challenge, and the most crucial. A conventional door, flat and rigid, would seal the entrance but would also be vulnerable to wind pressure and difficult to insulate. James designed something different, a low barrier of stacked stones that rose 3 feet, with a wooden door frame above just 30 inches tall, faced with heavy planks lined with layers of canvas and dried moss. Opening the door required ducking through the frame and stepping over the stone barrier, awkward but effective. The barrier created another air pocket, another layer of insulation, another obstacle to heat loss. By December 15th, the structure was complete. James moved his few possessions inside, his bedroll, his grandfather's knife, his father's surveying equipment, his mother's books wrapped in oiled cloth, a change of clothes, the small pot he cooked in, a larger pot for melting snow, a sack of beans, another of flour, salt, dried meat, matches wrapped carefully in a tin. He lit his first fire, feeding it carefully with small pieces of dry pine. Smoke rose cleanly through the hole at the dome's crown. Within an hour, the interior temperature had risen from 32 degrees to 58. Outside, the thermometer he had mounted on the wind baffle read 23 degrees. James sat on his sleeping platform, looking around at walls that curved protectively around him, at firelight that danced across smooth clay surfaces, at the small window letting in pale afternoon light, and felt something he hadn't felt since his parents died: safe. He began keeping records, something his father's training had ingrained in him. Every morning and evening, he recorded temperatures inside and outside, noted wind conditions, precipitation, fuel consumption, observations about how the structure performed. He filled the pages of an old account book he'd found discarded, writing in careful script by firelight, creating data that would eventually silence every doubter. December brought serious cold, temperatures dropping into the single digits at night, struggling to reach 20 during the day. Snow fell, accumulated, blanketed the ridge in white. James's dome disappeared under it, became just another feature of the mountainside, invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside, with a small fire burning a few hours morning and evening, the temperature stayed between 50 and 60 degrees. James wore a single layer of wool clothing, comfortable enough to work on small tasks. Read his mother's books, sleep without shivering. His fuel consumption, approximately 15 pounds of wood per day, gathered from deadfall in the forest below his ridge. In town, families burned through that much wood in an hour, trying desperately to heat drafty cabins that leaked warmth through every crack and corner. Christmas came and went. James marked it by reading from his mother's Bible. Remembering her voice reading the same passages aloud when he was small, he allowed himself an extra portion of beans, cooked with a bit of the precious salt pork he'd been saving. The structure creaked occasionally as temperatures swung from day to night, stones expanding and contracting minutely, but nothing shifted, nothing failed. January arrived with a cold snap that had people in town talking nervously. Temperatures plunged below zero, stayed there for days. James recorded 0 degrees outside on January 7th. Inside, 54 degrees with no fire burning, just residual heat from the previous evening's fire still radiating from the stone walls and floor. February came in cold but stable. James had established a routine: wake at dawn, light a small fire to take the chill off, and heat water for washing and cooking, eat breakfast, spend the short daylight hours gathering firewood from the forest below, return before dark, light the evening fire, eat dinner, read or work on small repairs to his clothing and equipment, sleep. Simple, sustainable, comfortable. Then came the storm. It began on February 21st with a strange warm wind from the south, temperatures surging into the 40s, snow melting, the valley exhaling like it had been holding its breath. People ventured outside, hung laundry, children played in slush. The barometer James had traded a week's labor for dropped precipitously. The wind shifted to the northwest. The temperature plunged 20 degrees in 2 hours. By nightfall, it was 5 below zero and falling. By midnight, the wind had risen to a sustained howl that shook buildings in town. By dawn of the 22nd, the temperature had dropped to -18, and the wind was tearing at anything not firmly secured. It got worse. Over the next 4 days, the temperature dropped to -32, then -38, finally bottoming out at -42 degrees on the morning of February 25th. The wind never stopped, day or night. Sustained gusts that felt like physical blows, ripping shingles off roofs, tearing doors from hinges, shattering windows that contracted too fast in the brutal cold. In town, families burned furniture when they ran out of firewood. 3 children and an elderly man died of exposure when their cabin's chimney caught fire, and they had to evacuate into the storm. 2 men froze to death trying to reach the trading post for supplies. Houses that had stood for years groaned and cracked, corner joints failing, walls bowing inward under wind pressure. Thomas Harrigan's ranch house, the finest building in the valley with its 2 stories and multiple fireplaces, became almost uninhabitable. Despite burning wood at a ferocious rate, the interior temperature struggled to reach 40 degrees. His wife and children huddled in one room with every blanket in the house piled on, and still they shivered. One of his ranch hands, sleeping in the bunkhouse, suffered frostbite on 3 toes that would later require amputation. On the ridge, James sat comfortably at 56 degrees. The wind that was destroying buildings in the valley flowed over and around his dome like water around a stone. The curb surface offered nothing for the wind to grip, no flat wall to push against, no corner to use as a lever. The structure that Harrigan had mocked for having no corners proved its strength precisely because it had no corners. The wind simply parted around it and rejoined on the other side, frustrated, impotent. The snow that buried the dome 3 feet deep added insulation, not weight. The dome's curve distributed the load evenly, every square inch bearing an equal share. The structure that people predicted would collapse under snow's weight was actually strengthened by it. Cocooned in nature's perfect insulator, James maintained his routine with minor adjustments. He burned slightly more wood, kept the fire going longer, but his consumption was still a fraction of what people in the valley were using. 20 pounds of wood per day at the storm's worst, compared to the 100 pounds or more families were desperately feeding to their stoves and fireplaces. On the morning of February 26th, the wind finally broke. The temperature remained brutally cold, -35, but the air was still for the first time in 5 days. The valley exhaled again, this time in exhaustion and grief. Sarah Chen, worried despite herself, decided to check on the boy who'd built the impossible shelter. She convinced her husband to come along, partly for propriety, partly because she wasn't sure she could make the journey alone in deep snow. They set out at dawn, wearing every piece of warm clothing they owned, carrying snowshoes and poles, moving slowly up the ridge. The journey that normally took 30 minutes required 2 hours. They struggled through drifts, fought the altitude, arrived exhausted and half-frozen, despite their heavy clothing. Sarah's face was chapped raw by wind, her husband's beard crusted with ice from his own breath. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, where they expected to find James's structure. At first they saw nothing, just a gentle rise in the snowfield that could have been a natural feature. Then Sarah spotted the wind baffle, its curved wall just barely visible above the drifted snow, and the dark rectangle of the entrance. "He's dead," her husband said flatly. "No smoke, no movement. He's been frozen for days." But Sarah had spotted something else. A neat path shoveled from the entrance to the woodpile, and the woodpile itself, carefully maintained, stacked under a lean-to that had survived the storm intact. "Look," she said, pointing. As they watched, the door opened, and James emerged, ducking through the low entrance and straightening up. He wore a single layer of wool shirt, no coat, no hat. He carried a bucket and walked calmly to the snow, filled it, turned back toward his door. He spotted them and stopped. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, are you all right? Come inside, you look half frozen." They followed him like sleepwalkers, ducking through the entrance, stepping over the stone barrier. The interior was dark after the snow reflected brilliance outside, but wonderfully, impossibly warm. Sarah felt it hit her like a wave, warmth radiating from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the air. She stopped just inside, overwhelmed. James was already stirring the coals in his fire pit, adding small sticks, bringing the fire back to life. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the sleeping platform. "Warm up." They sat. Sarah pulled off her gloves and pressed her hands against the stone wall behind her. It was warm to the touch, actively radiating heat. "James," she said, her voice unsteady. What temperature is it in here?" "Right now, about 52 degrees, was 60 last night. Should be back to 60 within the hour once the fire's going properly." "52," her husband repeated. "It's 35 below outside." 42 below yesterday morning," James said. He pulled his record book from a shelf, opened it, showed them page after page of careful notations. "Inside temperature hasn't dropped below 50 degrees since I moved in. Average is about 57. I burn about 20 pounds of wood per day, less on warmer days." Sarah's husband reached out and touched the wall, the floor, put his hand near the small fire James had built. "How is this possible?" James explained patiently, the same way he'd tried to explain to Harrigan months earlier. The thermal mass of stones and earth absorbing heat during the day, releasing it at night. The round shape eliminating corners where cold could concentrate. The dome shape shedding wind and distributing snow weight. The earth bermid walls insulating against temperature swings. The small, efficient fire-heating stone that stayed warm for hours, the low entrance trapping warm air inside. Every element working together, no single innovation, but a system where each part enhanced every other part. "The principles aren't new," James said. "Indigenous peoples have built structures like this for thousands of years. Underground pit houses, adobe, igloos are domed for the same reason. Europeans built thatched roundhouses before they switched to square timber frames. This works because it's old knowledge, proven knowledge. I just built it with materials that would last. Sarah's husband sat in silence, his worldview rearranging itself around the simple fact of his own comfort. He had nearly frozen to death in his own store. Despite having walls and a stove and plenty of fuel, this boy was comfortable in a stone bubble built into a mountainside, with barely any fire at all. The town needs to know about this, he said finally. They do know, James replied. They've known since September. They just didn't believe it would work. They'll believe it now. Half the buildings in the valley have damage. 3 children died. People are desperate. He looked at James directly. Will you teach us how to do this? James was quiet for a moment. He thought about Harrigan's mockery, about being thrown out into a storm by his own uncle, about a lifetime of being dismissed and underestimated. He thought about his grandfather, who had taught him freely, never asking for anything in return, except that the knowledge be used well. Yes, James said. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Word spread through the valley like water finding its level, person to person, family to family, carried by people who had seen James's structure with their own eyes or talked to the Chens who had been inside. The crazy boy's shelter had survived conditions that destroyed proper buildings. More than survived, had kept him comfortable while people in expensive houses nearly froze. Thomas Harrigan was among the last to hear, partly because people were reluctant to tell him he'd been wrong, partly because he was dealing with his own crisis. His grand house had suffered structural damage, beams cracked by extreme cold, one wall bowing dangerously inward where corner joints had failed. His fuel consumption during the storm had been ruinous, burning through his entire winter stockpile in 5 days. He was facing the choice of buying wood at inflated prices or spending the rest of winter in a dangerously weakened building. Pride warred with practicality. Practicality won, barely. He rode up to the ridge on a relatively mild day in early March, temperature hovering around 15 degrees. He found James outside, working on an addition to his woodshed. James saw him coming, straightened, waited. Harrigan sat on his horse for a long moment, looking at the structure that was barely visible above the snow, at the boy who had built it. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual bluster. I'd like to see inside. Of course. Tie your horse by the woodpile. He'll be out of the wind there. Inside, Harrigan stood in the center of the small space, turning slowly. He touched the walls, the floor, examined the dome overhead, the fire pit, the careful organization. James had lit no fire for this visit, but the interior was still noticeably warmer than outside. What's the temperature? Harrigan asked. 48 degrees. Was 60 this morning. Outside is 15. How much wood? 20 pounds yesterday, about the same today. Harrigan did the math silently. His house had burned 300 pounds yesterday, keeping interior temperature around 45 degrees. This structure, 1/6 the fuel, was warmer. The efficiency wasn't just better, it was a different order of magnitude entirely. I was wrong, Harrigan said, the words clearly difficult. You built something remarkable, something I didn't understand and didn't take the time to understand. He paused. My house is damaged. I need to rebuild before next winter. Would you be willing to share your knowledge? Yes, James said simply. I can pay. I don't want payment. I'll teach you the principles. What you do with them is your choice. Over the next 3 months, James became an unlikely teacher. He drew diagrams, explained concepts, demonstrated techniques. He was patient with questions, honest about what he didn't know, generous with information. Some people came genuinely wanting to learn, others came skeptical and left convinced. A few came determined to find flaws and eventually had to admit there weren't any. The first new structure was built by a young couple whose cabin had burned during the storm when their chimney sparked. They had nothing, were living on charity. James helped them design a smaller version of his shelter, 12 feet across instead of 18, suitable for 2 people. They built it together over 6 weeks, James teaching as they worked. When they moved in, they wept at the comfort of it, at having a home again that felt safe and warm and permanent. The structure had cost them labor and scavenged materials, but almost no cash, built from stones that littered every hillside and clay dug from creek banks. Others followed. By summer of 1889, 7 new shelters had been built in the valley, each one adapted to its specific site and occupants, but all based on James's core principles. Build round, build low, use thermal mass, work with nature rather than fighting it. By 1892, there were 24. By 1895, 63. The university in Missoula heard about the unusual structures and sent a professor of engineering to investigate. He arrived skeptical, left a convert, published a paper on the thermal efficiency of curved versus rectilinear architecture. The paper cited James by name, though James never read it. He was too busy building. Thomas Harrigan rebuilt his house using hybrid principles, keeping a square layout his wife insisted on, but incorporating stone thermal mass walls, better insulation, smaller rooms that were easier to heat. It wasn't as efficient as a pure round structure, but it was 3 times more efficient than the original house and suffered no damage in subsequent harsh winters. Harrigan never became warm toward James, but he developed a grudging respect, and when people asked about the changes to his house, he credited the boy who'd proved him wrong. It was as close to an apology as his pride would allow. James built 3 more structures over the next 5 years, each one an evolution of the original design, incorporating lessons learned and adapting to different conditions. He built one for a widow and her 4 children, larger than his own, with sleeping platforms for 6. He built one as a community shelter near the mountain pass, where travelers sometimes got caught by sudden storms. He built one for the Shoshone elders who had cared for him after his grandfather died, a gesture of gratitude they accepted with quiet dignity. He never charged for his work, accepting food and basic supplies and trade, living simply on the ridge in his original structure. He never sought recognition, never claimed to have invented anything, always credited his grandfather and the traditional knowledge Stands and Wind had passed down. When people called him a genius, he corrected them. "I'm not clever, I just listened to people who knew more than I did." In 1894, at 22, he married the widow he'd built the shelter for, a woman 6 years his senior with 4 children who needed a father. They expanded his original structure, adding a second connected dome for the children, creating a figure-8 floor plan that gave everyone space while maintaining thermal efficiency. They lived simply and well, raising the 4 children plus 2 more of their own, teaching all of them the principles that had kept the family safe and warm. James lived on that ridge for 47 years, until his death in 1935 at age 63. The structure he'd built at 16 remained his home for life, modernized eventually with a proper window and a more efficient stove, but fundamentally unchanged. By the time he died, his technique had been adopted across Montana and into Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Thousands of people had used his principles to build shelters, root cellars, community buildings, saving incalculable amounts of fuel and countless lives. His funeral drew over 300 people, some traveling from hundreds of miles away. His eldest stepson gave the eulogy, speaking of a man who had taken nothing and made it into something, who had shared knowledge freely, who had lived according to principles he never compromised. "He was called crazy," the son said, standing at the graveside while snow fell softly. "He was mocked and dismissed, but he built anyway. He believed when nobody else did, and what he built saved us all. Rest now, grandfather Stands and Wind is waiting, and the shelters will hold." Today, James's original structure still stands on that ridge outside Missoula, maintained now by the Montana Historical Society as an education site. Visitors can see inside, can touch the walls that still radiate warmth on cold days from passive solar heat, can read James's original record books preserved under glass, can see the thermometer still mounted on the wind baffle showing the contrast between interior and exterior temperatures. 3 memorial markers stand outside the entrance. The first commemorates James Whitaker. With the simple epitaph he requested, "He listened well." The second honors Stands and Wind, grandfather and teacher, who died before seeing his knowledge save so many lives. The third remembers the people who died in the brutal winter of 1889, their names carved in stone, a reminder of what happens when we ignore wisdom in favor of convenience. The storm of February 1889 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged, that the way things had always been done was the way they should continue, that square buildings with tall walls and peaked roofs were the only proper way to provide shelter, regardless of whether they actually worked in the environment where they were built. James proved that wrong, not with theory, but with a thermometer, and the simple fact of his survival. The principles he used were ancient, Developed by indigenous peoples across North America over thousands of years, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings with thick adobe walls and south-facing orientations. The Plains tribes built earth lodges partially underground with domed roofs. The Inuit built igloos that stayed warm enough to melt water, despite being made entirely of snow. Traditional peoples from Mongolia to Ireland to the American Southwest developed round, earth-sheltered structures because they worked, because they conserved heat and shed wind and lasted for generations. Modern science has confirmed what stands and wind knew intuitively. Thermal mass stores heat energy and releases it slowly, moderating temperature swings. Earth provides insulation with an R value that increases with depth. Curved surfaces distribute loads evenly and offer minimal wind resistance. Small, efficient heat sources in well-insulated spaces provide more comfort than large, inefficient fires in drafty buildings. James succeeded because he was willing to question conventional wisdom, to consider that the way settlers had been building might be wrong for the environment they were trying to survive in. He had nothing, no money, no tools, no support, but he had observation, patience, and willingness to learn from people whose knowledge the dominant culture dismissed as primitive. What the established ranchers and merchants built quickly and cheaply to impress their neighbors fell apart within decades, abandoned or demolished when maintenance became too expensive. What a 16-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully still stands after 137 years, still functional, still teaching. There's a metaphor there about building to last versus building to impress, about indigenous wisdom versus colonial arrogance, about working with nature versus trying to dominate it. James never became famous beyond his region, never wrote books, never sought patents or profit. He simply lived, raised his family, built when asked, taught when approached, and let his work speak for itself. The 7 structures he personally built sheltered 43 people directly and influenced the design of hundreds more that sheltered thousands. Through the coldest winters, they provided warmth and safety when conventional buildings failed, and they did it using a fraction of the resources others consumed. Most of those structures are gone now, victims of time and changing land use. But the knowledge survives, experiencing a renaissance in modern, passive solar and earth-sheltered design movements. So, here's the question for you. What abandoned wisdom exists in your life? What dismissed knowledge has everyone written off as primitive or outdated? What might happen if you looked at it the way James looked at his grandfather's teachings? Not as relics of an inferior past, but as solutions developed over generations, proven by survival itself. If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about survival, sustainability, and the value of listening to voices outside the mainstream, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, observation, and courage. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't given to you by following everyone else's blueprint. Sometimes it's the one you build with your own 2 hands, guidance from those who came before, and the courage to do what makes sense even when everyone says you're crazy.